John Lees-Miller to speak to us this afternoon. He's working in Bristol in the Department of Engineering Mathematics at Bristol, and is part of a group that extends beyond the university that's developing a personal rapid transit system. This is interesting in its own right as a piece of engineering, but I think some of us here are quite interested in it because it raises a further example of an interesting scheduling, routine, resource allocation problem which John will describe.
So, thank you. Can you all hear me? Is that okay? Great. So, right. Thank you, Frank. So this is joint work with my supervisor, Eddie Wilson, and John Hammersley, who's at Ultra PRT, where I also work part-time. So, personal rapid transit. What is it? So one of the advantages of working with a company is that they spend money on nice promotional videos that tell you what they do. So I'm going to let it do the work.
ULTRA stands for Urban Light Transit, a new concept in travel for the 21st century. 12 years in development, ULTRA brings a fresh approach to traffic congestion and pollution, responding to the needs of passengers. It's quick, comfortable, and convenient. ULTRA is an automated transit system using many four-person, zero-emission electric vehicles. ULTRA gets you to your destination faster than a car and avoids parking hassles. ULTRA is well suited to serve offices and airports, blending in easily with modern architecture. ULTRA makes transit and carpooling more effective, connecting a single train station to 30,000 desks. Stations are on a separate track from the main track, so that stopped vehicles do not interfere with the free flow of passing traffic. With ULTRA, you don't wait for vehicles. Vehicles wait for you. Modern communications and location sensing technology allow vehicles to run at precisely controlled intervals, creating a high-capacity system. Moving smoothly and silently, the battery-powered vehicles are safe and reliable, traveling up to 3 times faster than a car. PRT allows complex transit networks, weaving tracks around buildings with tight turns, bringing transit right to the front door, placing many stations close together. Tracks don't have to go simply in a straight line. The network accommodates non-stop, point-to-point, direct service to all stations, every time. ULTRA stations can be located adjacent to buildings or even directly on the second floor, further increasing convenience. At high-capacity locations, ULTRA stations have correspondingly more vehicle berths and more efficient vehicle choreography. ULTRA is easy to use. After making your choice, ULTRA will take you there non-stop. The vehicles allow easy access for bikes and wheelchairs, with plenty of space for people, backpacks, and briefcases. London's Heathrow Airport will host the world's first ULTRA system, with operations starting in fall of 2008. Construction at Heathrow has already begun. ULTRA is transit for a sustainable future.
Okay. And I think, there we go. Right. So that's PRT. Key points are that it's demand responsive, so it's not like a bus. It doesn't run on a schedule. They use small vehicles, much like taxis, and the vehicles move point to point. So it's very much a network-oriented system, as opposed to traditional transit where you have a line and you have some stops on the line and you move a large number of people between those stops. Here we have a more stops and not necessarily in a line. So computer guidance is nice, but at present it takes dedicated infrastructure in order to be able to do that. So on one hand you have a network system, but on the other hand you have to build the network. So that's the key sort of design trade-off that just guides a lot of the decisions. So most of this talk is going to be about a particular problem in PRT, but first we'll do a little bit more of the background stuff. So Heathrow, you heard in the video, has been built. So that was a rather old video. You can also tell that it did not open in fall 2008. It is going to open in a couple of months, is the plan. So it is very close to being done now. So this is, so the route is, we go from a car park, business parking down here, and we have 2 stations, one on each of these little ears. And we have another station in Terminal 5. And it takes about 5 minutes to get from one end to the other. So that picture I showed you was from the car park end. This is one of our vehicles. You can see that it's not very large. For reference, you can see some cars in the background. And this rail here is about waist height, so it's a small vehicle. The Terminal 5 end looks a bit like this. So this is a station. This is where people are allowed to get on and off because there's no interaction with the vehicles when they're moving. So we've got 4 of these berths. And the way it works is you walk up to one of these destination selection panels and you tell it to go to car park A or car park B, and you get in and you go, and that's it. So no schedules and very easy to use. So the inside of the vehicle looks a bit like this. It's got seats 4 people comfortably with luggage and things, and you can squeeze up to 6. That's an in-flight screen, so they can tell you how much further you have to go. So a pretty modern sort of upper market vehicle. So I mentioned the infrastructure. Even though you have to build your own infrastructure, it is important to note that we can make it pretty light. So this is us running through the middle here, and you can see that this is one of our columns, and that's actually around the same depth as this big road column. So even though we have to build dedicated infrastructure, it's not so bad. So that's pretty much it for the overview of the technology. But if anyone has questions about that, I'm quite happy to pause here and just take some questions and how it works, comments.
It's expensive.
So the Heathrow system, the figure is about 30 million pounds to build this pilot system. A lot of that was sort of one-time costs associated with developing the technology. So expensive, but not as expensive as many other transit modes. Any other? Should we? We'll get into the more mathematical things then. So Heathrow system had only 3 stations, so that was fairly simple. In the sort of near to medium term, we're looking at networks with more stations, so in the sort of 10 to 50 stations range. This network on the left comes from the town of Corby, where we did a case study. So the way that we've built this network is we've got some stations and we connected them using one-way loops of guideway. And there's another one up here. So that's generally how we build them. But one sort of interesting question that you might be interested in is, can we do that in a more principled way? So one problem that we think could be interesting is this network design problem. So if you know the demand roughly between each pair of stations, and someone gives you a graph that includes lots of possible networks sort of inside it, you have to choose a subset of the edges that still connects all the stations. The difficult bit is maybe that you have lots of conflicting objectives. So on the one hand, you don't want to build a lot of track because that costs money. On the other hand, you don't want to have very circuitous routes because you end up having to use more vehicles and that costs you money. And you also have to worry about the network being robust to failures. So on this example network, there's this fairly long link with quite a lot of load on it. So if you do get a failure there, you end up with people stranded. So it's important to note that this is just a single lane of guideway. you can build double lanes, but of course it costs you more money. So I believe that the first question has sort of been addressed. This is related to Steiner problems, except it's in a directed setting. And I've seen the first two done in communications networks, where you want to build an infrastructure. You don't want it to cost too much, but you want to keep the number of hops down. So there's a sort of latency penalty as well. But if anyone has thoughts on that, I'm very keen to see what people say. So one other problem that we've been looking at is station sizing. So in the video, it showed you some pictures of stations, but they were moving very fast. So this is how it looks. It's important to emphasize that the stations are offline. So if you are not stopping, so if your destination is not at this station, then you just keep going. That's what this bypass lane is for. And then we have a bunch of berths. And we also, behind the scenes, have a buffer of vehicles that we can use to replenish the berths. So this is sort of suggested should be a kind of queuing model that you could look at. The simplest one that we've come up with, that we sort of used to get an initial picture of how this could look, is just a multi-server queue with, in this case, 4 servers, and the service rate's sort of set to account for how long it takes people to load into them. But that, of course, assumes that you can keep the berths full with vehicles. And in fact, you have lots of complicating things going on, like vehicles running out, exhausting the buffer. And you also have both full and empty vehicles, or occupied and empty vehicles, that you have to treat slightly differently. So that seems to be a fairly rich application. So those were two sort of, sure.
I was just wondering, is the current idea to have this as a centrally controlled network, or is it decentralized?
So certainly Heathrow is centralized. For very large networks, we think that communications networks are sufficiently more advanced than transport networks. We can probably still centralize them. But eventually, we'd probably want to cut the region up into zones. And that's another area that one could look at, is how much can you decentralize. So right, so those were two sort of minor problems that I thought I'd put up there just to see if people liked them. The main thing that I work on in my PhD studies is the empty vehicle problem. So you're going to have to move some of your empty vehicles, or some of your vehicles are going to have to be empty, and somewhere there has to be a mechanism that decides which ones to move and where to move them. So again, we've got a few things that we could want to do. If you're a taxi company, you're almost certainly going to do the first one. You want to minimize your empty vehicle running time, because you have to pay a driver, and he's not generating any revenue when he's empty. So we'll show also that that corresponds with maximizing the throughput that you can get through the system. But the economics of PRT are a little bit different, because basically the operating costs are much lower, because you don't have to pay a driver. So when we do economic sort of cost and benefit studies, we often find that the best way to run the system is with very low waiting times. So one could instead look at minimizing passenger waiting time, and so at the mean, or something that penalizes very long waits, because we all know that if something is a sort of reliable delay, you can plan for that, but if it's a long and unpredictable delay, that's much more annoying. So I'm going to go through some things that we've done and some things that are not quite done yet. So one of them is the sort of stability question. We've done a little bit of work on that under these assumptions, which I'll go through in a second. And then we'll look at some ways to assess how well you're doing when it comes to passenger waiting time. So having talked about congestion at stations and things, we're now going to ignore all of that for the time being. That means that vehicles always take the quickest paths, so that makes things a little bit nicer. We're also going to ignore everything that happens at stations, so these are just points where vehicles can accumulate. We're going to assume the demand is stationary and known, so in practice, of course, it fluctuates over the day, but hopefully the things that we learn by looking at this carry over. Also, we're going to ignore any kind of sharing where multiple people could get into the same vehicle. So in other words, it's sort of a pure taxi service. So under those assumptions, we can do some things in the fluid limit. We'll get into what I mean by that in a second. So we'll start with a network like the Corby network, and we compute shortest paths, and that gets travel times. We also need a demand matrix that tells us the average rates at which people move between each pair of stations. So we assume that we have one of those. Then we do a little optimization problem on the next slide. And the result is that we find the empty vehicle flows that correspond to the full vehicle flows. So under our ride-sharing assumption, the demand in passengers per hour is the same as vehicles per hour. So the optimization problem we solve is just a linear program. So T and D are the travel times and the occupied demands. And we want to find the empty vehicle flows. So all we do is minimize the total number of vehicles we need, subject to flow conservation. So this is, say, minutes times vehicles per minute, which gets you vehicles. And it's worth noting that because the T's and D's are constants, that's the same as minimizing your empty vehicles. That LP has some properties. It's actually a transportation problem, which is very well studied. You can actually solve it even more efficiently than normal, which isn't really a problem anyway. Another nice sort of consequence of that is that you know that you never get any cycles of empty vehicle flow. So the solution to this problem always defines a tree, like I've kind of sketched in on this Corby network. And those are where the vehicles flow, the empty vehicles flow. So the other thing that we've done with this result is to sort of relate it back to the stability question, which motivates this idea of intensity. So if you just evaluate your objective function at the optimum, that gives you your required fleet size. And if you only have a certain number of vehicles to start with, then you can just define this ratio. And that seems to be a useful thing to look at. We'll see a variety of consequences of that later. So if this thing is larger than 1, then of course people are arriving faster than you can serve them, and the queues will build up indefinitely. Whether this is also sufficient to ensure that if this is strictly less than 1, then the queues don't build up, we're pretty sure it is, but we haven't really built the theoretical machinery needed to show that yet. That is work in progress. So one thing we have done with this is to implement a couple of different algorithms. So these are actually online heuristics that we can run in simulation, and then we can evaluate them based on how far they, or how close they get to the intensity limit, which is intensity 1. So for a fixed network and a fleet size, you choose some initial demand, and then you just scale it up and down, keeping the proportions fixed. So this is like orienting a ray in the space of all the demands that you could think of, and then you just walk along there until you hit the boundary. And then you can see how well the algorithm actually does, whether it makes it all the way. So before we can show you some results on that, we need to have some algorithms. So there are some things that have been done for PRT. This technology has actually been around for quite a while. You know, the first PRT system was proposed in 1959, believe it or not, before they even had computers to do the steering. You just had to press a button to tell it which way to go. But anyway, people have done a little bit of work on this, but not a lot of conclusive results out of it. So we'll look at one of those. For taxis, there are some results out there, and we'll look at one of those. And the other ones we will come back to later a little bit. So the first one, which was sort of PRT inspired, is what we call longest waiting passenger first, and that pretty much sums it up. So we keep track of the next station for every vehicle, and we also keep track of the passenger queues. And the rule we use is that when a vehicle becomes idle, we find the longest waiting passenger and we give him the vehicle. If a person arrives and there are lots of idle vehicles, we just choose the closest one. So in this case, we'd go there. It's worth noting, though, that it would have been quicker to serve a passenger at this other station. So there's a trade-off here. So the motivation behind serving the longest waiting passenger first is that it keeps the waiting time distribution under control. But on the other hand, you end up making longer empty vehicle trips as a result of this, because the longest waiting passenger can be quite far away from the first idle vehicle that comes up. So we'll see that later. The other heuristic, which is for taxis, is formulated a bit differently. So if we forget about PRT for a second and just talk about taxis, you can imagine people arriving at certain locations and they need to go to certain locations. And so the origins are dark and the destinations are light. And each vehicle just maintains a list of passengers that it's going to serve. So when a new passenger arrives, the decision we make is we find a vehicle and choose to append the passenger to that list. And the rule we follow is minimize the passenger's waiting time, given that the vehicle has to serve all the rest of the passengers in its list. So in this case, the green region compares to the red region, and the green one is smaller. So those are two very simple heuristics that we've looked at, and we'll see some results. So waiting time. So what we've done here is we've chosen an initial demand, and then we've scaled it to produce one that has intensity, say, 0.6, and then we run a simulation with that demand held constant, measure the waiting times with both heuristics, and you can see that indeed the longest waiting passenger first heuristic does do slightly better on the waiting times, at least on the Corby network, and both of them saturate very close to intensity 1. So that sort of gives some experimental evidence for why that intensity measure might be a meaningful one. For the grid network, though, things are a bit different. So one thing to note is that neither of them saturates it quite so close. And also the longest waiting passenger first one actually saturates a much lower intensity, around 0.85. And you can see this better from other graphs, but I figured I'd show this one in because it talks about waiting times, which is the next point. So one other thing to notice on these graphs is that the waiting times are actually not very good. Even if you have almost no demand, you still have about a 3-minute waiting time. And this is because the heuristics only move vehicles when a passenger has arrived. So clearly, if you want to reduce someone's waiting time, you've got to move them in advance. So otherwise, you get this problem where if all the demand is from left to right, of course, the vehicles sit on the wrong end, and then they only come back once someone is there waiting for them. So this introduces the problem where you sort of have to gamble about where to send your vehicles. So this is just a little illustrative example. If this vehicle is idle and A and B both need empty vehicles on average, and you want to choose whether to send it to A or B, you could say, well, let's choose the closest one, which is B, for 2 minutes, but maybe it has less demand than the other one at A. And if you wanted to choose the one with more demand, then you'd end up paying a longer empty vehicle trip. So you have to sort of make that trade-off. And the other key point is that you've got other vehicles floating around that are going to affect your decisions. So we've started looking at this, but we're not very far along in truth. So one thing we have looked at is if you had all the information that you could want, so you had all perfect information about when everyone was going to arrive, you could solve what we call the static problem. So that's a problem, so I'll go through that now. So here you assume that you know the initial positions of the vehicles, you know when the passengers arrive, where they arrive, and where they're going, and you can turn this information into a graph like this one, where you've got vehicles and passengers, and the solution that you want is, it's actually easier if I remove one of the vehicles. You want to get from your vehicle node through the passengers in some order to the sync node at minimum cost. So that is, of course, if you want to minimize the sum of the edge costs, that's like a traveling salesman problem. It's actually more of it's an asymmetric traveling salesman path problem, if you want to be technical. So that seems to be reasonably difficult, except that not all of the passengers arrive at once. So that can have some effects. So the other key point is that if you solve it as a traveling salesman problem, that means that you're minimizing the empty vehicle travel time. But you don't have to solve it like that. You can solve it as what's known as a traveling repairman problem, where instead of minimizing the travel costs, you minimize the delay to reach each of the nodes. So instead of counting this edge, let's say we served P0, then P1, then P2, instead of counting this edge once in the traveling salesman problem, you would count it 3 times, because each of the passengers has to wait that long, and then you'd count the next edge twice and the final edge once. And that's a different sort of cost structure. So anyway, the minimum latency or traveling repairman version is still NP hard, so it's still difficult. However, the fact that the passengers don't all arrive at once means that there is a sort of natural ordering that you can exploit, and we've done some work on exactly that, and it turns out it's actually quite effective for most of the intensity range. So this is a less graphical description of the Bell and Wang nearest neighbors heuristic that we talked about earlier. So if DK is the destination, so that's the station at which your vehicle becomes idle, and AK is the time at when it becomes idle, then this is the statement that gives you the minimum waiting time. And when you choose to update the vehicle's state, you say that you can't leave before time now, even if the vehicle was idle earlier. So a simple way to cheat is to let yourself leave at either now or the original arrival time. So these TDKI terms are the empty vehicle trips, and basically the heuristic we looked at was just to, instead of paying the empty vehicle trip starting now, you get to begin it in the past. And that very simple heuristic seems to do quite well. So this is the Bell and Wang. So I should mention these are preliminary results, as in I ran them on the train on the way here. So a grain of salt is required. But so this is the Bell and Wang result, which is the same as last time. And this is what you can do if you have perfect information. So you can see that through almost the whole intensity range, at least on the lower half, of course, you can do very well. So this looks a lot like the sort of curve you get from a multi-server queuing system with lots of servers, which is basically what this seems to boil down to. So that was sort of interesting in that we now know that the difficult bit is the gambling. So now we have to focus on that. So that is the plan going forward. So basically, if you have this strong heuristic that seems to do fairly well when you give it perfect information, one thing that seems natural to try is to generate a bunch of samples from your future distribution and run your heuristic on them and see what the good actions are. The other thing that we need to do is to work on some more formulations that can hopefully give us a better theoretical framework in which to do this instead of just running simulations. So that's the plan for the next year or so, and that's it. So the capacity region, which I didn't actually use that word, but that's what I meant by the linear programming thing. So we've used that to look at the throughput of algorithms, and we've got some useful results on that. Basically, very simple heuristics seem to do fairly well, though not perfectly well. And we can't yet do the same thing for passenger waiting times. That seems to be harder. We have this thing using the perfect information, so that's the static problem. But it doesn't really help you very much because it told you that your mean waiting time was larger than 0 for most of the range, which you knew anyway. So the other thing that was nice is that this nearest neighbors type strategy that we developed is very simple, seems to be quite effective. And that's something that people have observed with other sort of traveling repairman type problems. So that's it. Some acknowledgements. Martin Lowson is the president of ATS, which is now called Ultra PRT. And I'd also like to thank Frank for helping us out on some discussions a year ago, which have been very helpful. And there are references available if you ask. So thanks. Happy to take questions and to discuss things. I'm quite keen to do that.
Thank you very much, John. Any questions or comments?
Presumably you really want to be able to make it learn from experience and take account of the fact that certain times of the day there's much more traffic in one direction than the other.
Right. So there is an inference problem there where you want to learn from the historical data. The good news is that we do have pretty high quality data about the past because it's all computerized, and when you press the button it tells us. We haven't looked very closely at sort of correlate, so presumably there are lots of factors you'd want to include in this analysis, like weather and known events and things. So there is an inference problem there, but I don't know of anyone that's looked at it in any detail.
How robust are the strategies to variations in levels of demand?
Excellent question. We don't know yet. So the nearest neighbor heuristic there didn't actually use any information about the demand, but so I'd expect that for heuristics where you're gambling and you have to base your decisions on future information, you'd want to have pretty good estimates. But at the same time,
Yeah, but your basic heuristics, they're liable to be stable over a fairly wide variety of input patterns, assuming it was theoretically possible.
we think so. We've tested maybe half a dozen networks and quite a few demands that we've generated in various ways. And they're all sort of consistent with that. But in terms of showing that that's the case in general, not there yet.
So just to ask a question, it's a question we've discussed already, but this might be interesting to the audience, that the bounds that you described assume that you can take any of the passengers that are waiting at a stop, and yet to prevent riots you might well take the first person in the queue to wherever that person wants to go to. So that may cause a reduction in the capacity region.
Yes. So we've done a little bit of looking into that. So one thing that's so I'll start with one thing is that the sort of static nearest neighbors heuristic can be modified to take into account that sort of first in, first out order. So we could have a look at what that does. In terms of dealing with the station layouts, we do have some flexibility on that. So it may help if I refer to a picture. So in this sort of situation, the vehicles arrive in this buffer, and then the system gets to choose which berth to send them to. So the first in, first out rule would be send them to the person who's waited the longest. But we could accommodate several destinations. So that would give a sort of limited ability to deal with the point Frank raises there.
So what you'd have, what the different berths would go to different places or different sets of places.
Right. So I guess the way it would work would be there would be a sign that says this berth is now going to destination A, and this one's going to destination B.
Right, so some sort of like output queues, but with the output ports grouped.
Right.
Yeah.
So yes.
Until 2 weeks ago, the people who run the local airport were intending to build 12,000 houses at the airport on the edge of Cambridge, and they were pushing hard to use Ultra to get people into town, and the county council have been resisting this. Is there a prospect that it will be allowed to have this in towns?
So yes, I mean the difficult bit is the infrastructure that you need. Clearly the infrastructure that works in the airport is not the same as would work here. People would not like having large elevated tracks running around. So you would have to tunnel it, which presents its own challenges. But I'm not really that sort of engineer. I don't know too much about exactly how how it could work here.
Yeah, and the things that were worrying the county council, apparently, apart from, as you say, the unsightly tracks, was vulnerability to vandalism, but I suppose that would be better in the tunnel.
So yes, on the Heathrow system, I mean, it's a very tightly controlled environment, and we also have CCTV on essentially every inch of everything. So it's unlikely there, but yes, I mean, any system with valuable components is going to be, you have to worry about vandalism. I think probably the technical ability is there to keep it safe. If you have sort of fare cards that identify people, you can certainly get vandalism inside the vehicles. Vandalism to infrastructure is more difficult, though.
So what's the comparison in costs of, say, building a track and building the same distance on the street level? Like a normal street road for cars and one of those.
I'm not exactly sure the answer to that one.
Is it remarkably cheaper or remarkably more expensive?
So the infrastructure that so it all depends on the related assumptions. So people, when they build roads are quite expensive, and the reasons for that are mainly political and things to do with that are not engineering reasons. The actual cost of building one of these PRT guideways is not that large. We estimate in the sort of $10 to $20 million a mile sort of range, which is typically lower than what people would quote for roads, I think. But that's, again, not exactly in my area.
And actually,
Well, so I guess it depends what kind of road you build.
if I built, for instance, Mattingly Road, that's 5 to
Okay.
10. That one.
Question about the algorithms. You presented 2 or 3, but they seemed pretty basic at the moment.
Yep.
Nearest neighbor is pretty easy, I think. Have you had any other ideas which are still, well, not perhaps researched, but you might consider in the future?
So most of the things we're thinking about have to do with this gambling problem, where how do you decide where to send your idle vehicles to? So one way to look at that is sampling. I mentioned you could consider each one and value it based on a sample of future things, but of course that would be fairly expensive, one would think. In practice, it may well be that that's the way to do it, just because one of these vehicles costs around £100,000, and you can buy a lot of computing power for that much, so you can certainly do that. Other ideas are, so you have these stations and you have an idea of the relative demands between them, and you want to sort of keep a buffer of vehicles there. So you could try to decide on the proportion of your fleet that you should try to keep idle at each station, and then solve a similar sort of transportation problem to try to restore the balances. I think there's a connection there with ambulance location. I think people do solve those sorts of problems. But this one is a bit more dynamic, because in ambulance location, you position your ambulances and you assume that by the time the next event comes, you've mostly got your ambulances back to their positions, whereas in this case, I think you would have to maybe make some correction for the fact that you would never be able to actually get back to your ideal state.
Should we call this simulation?
Sure. So yeah, I can show you some, as we have some time. So one of the things that I do at the company is simulation stuff. So I work on networks like this. So this is essentially the same network that we had before, and we put in a destination OD matrix that tells us how big the demand is. And because I haven't set this up properly, I'm going to scale it back a little bit. And then basically we just hit run, and behind the scenes there's a simulated control system that will do all these computations. So the green dots are the occupied vehicles and the red dots are the empty ones. And right now some fairly simple heuristics are being used to do the empty vehicle stuff. It's fairly similar to the longest waiting passenger first. We do have a few other things implemented in here. I'm not sure I can show you those though. Might get in trouble. So we've got stations. Each one of these has 5 berths, and the number next to it is the number of passengers waiting. So right now we're doing fairly well. Not too many people waiting, and it looks like there is some station somewhere that has a queue because we have a 90-second or so average wait. It's probably this guy here, which is probably because I haven't set up the empty vehicle management stuff to do it properly yet. But, so right now we have a lot of tunable parameters that help us do this sort of gambling. But they are a bit difficult to set. So that was one of the motivations behind what I do. Some other things that we've been looking at are basically implementing those types of calculations that I showed with linear programs. And you can do things like assigning loads to portions of the networks and just see which ones are most heavily loaded and things like that, which is a useful thing as a design tool. And that's about the extent of that.
Do the vehicles all move at the same speed all the time, or can they accelerate it?
So that's a good question. So the vehicles follow what we call speed profiles around the network. So there is a central control system, and before your vehicle departs, it actually plans a speed profile for you the whole journey. And the vehicle's responsibility is to stay on schedule. So that allows us to plan ahead, and so that we don't send vehicles on a collision course at merges. So that works fairly well, assuming that the vehicles have enough power and that the network is not so large that the planning problem becomes too difficult. But so far, we haven't hit that limit yet.
So does that mean that the speed from A to B may vary depending on the other traffic and on... If I go along a route and choose to stop at the station, is it the sum of these two times, from A to the way station plus way station to the destination, or is it more complicated?
It will be a little bit more complicated. So there is before you set off, there will be a delay that depends on your route. So, and of course the other traffic. So that's how we manage congestion. Instead of having the vehicles build up on the line, they build up in the stations. So that's, I think, does that answer your question?
I was going to ask whether there was a sort of convoy effect in your simulation. It looked like there were 4 batches.
Yes. So it's difficult to say exactly what causes all of these things, but certainly there is so for empty vehicles, the way we've implemented it now, it will often make a decision where several vehicles leave at once on a sort of convoy. The other thing is that as the network gets more congested, if you want to hit a particular spot, it will sort of slow you down, and so there tends to be clustering. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, someone else.
Just a quick question. So what's your capacity like?
So on the Heathrow system, the vehicles are actually running at 6 seconds apart. So that's quite far. In the near future, we hope to get that down to 3 and eventually 2 seconds apart. So then if you run the calculation for 3 seconds, you can get 1,200 vehicles an hour on one line. And if you can fill them up with, say, ride sharing, where you have several people in a vehicle, then you get up to a fairly respectable sort of 4,800 passengers per hour per lane.
How fast do they go?
These ones in Heathrow top out at about 24 miles an hour, I think.
If the vehicles were all relatively cheap, then it'd be okay to have a large stash of vehicles everywhere.
And if the track was relatively cheap, then you'd get away with, you'd want to have far fewer vehicles. In for example, this Corby network, is it possible to say which one's more limiting, or are they both equally balanced, the constraint of number of vehicles and the constraint of track space?
So on Corby, yeah, we have run some simulations, and on Corby, the network is fairly close to its sort of maximum number of vehicles it can support. So we can run simulations like this where we look at different spacings between the vehicles, like 1 second and 6 seconds. And so this would tell you that with a fixed fleet size, 200 vehicles, you are fairly close to hitting the limit of what your infrastructure can support. So you'd have to build more tracks. On the other hand, the grid network that I showed earlier, it has lots of different alternative routes. And it has, you could put a lot more vehicles on it. So we can sort of quantify that trade-off in simulation, but that's so far the extent of it.
Is it that way around or the other way around? Because isn't that suggesting that at the grid network that changing the delay between vehicles isn't making much difference?
Right, I hope I said it correctly. So here, so by increasing the spacing between vehicles, you effectively reduce the capacity of your infrastructure to support vehicles. And here it doesn't make much difference. So you could add more vehicles.
But adding the more vehicles doesn't make much difference to the mean passenger waiting time.
No, until it saturates, because it doesn't have enough slots to let people out. So in
Corby,
yes.
when you increase the number of vehicles, then you can carry higher intensity before the passengers. So, any other questions? Okay, well, let's thank John. Thank you very much.